Hi, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. As the new president of the Latin American Relief Fund, I just wanted to say thank you for all your generous donations in this last month. As Cher said, we have made our goals. We will get our $10,000 match. We're thrilled with the direction it's going, and the need is greater than ever. Ignacio is receiving 70 to 100 people per night on many nights now because the caravans are arriving. And in addition, we've offered to help actually the INM office in San Miguel feed the migrants who are the multiple migrants who are showing up there. So we're also helping in San Miguel in addition to financing a lot of what happens at Abba House. So I just want to say thank you so much for everyone's generosity in this last month. It's really it's really helping a lot. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Francine Segan, an acclaimed food historian and author of 6 books, including Shakespeare's Kitchen, The Opera Lover's Cookbook, and Dolce, Italy's Sweets. She has contributed to a number of publications such as Epicurious and Saveur, and has appeared on PBS, the Food Network, and the Discovery Channel. She recently wrote a cover story on Italian chocolate desserts for La Cucina Italiana magazine and has given many presentations on this fascinating subject. Today, we're going to hear about her visit to Belize, where she explored the roots of cacao cultivation and chocolate making. We are so grateful that Francine is willing to share her time and expertise with us today.
Oh, thank you so much. And it's a delight chatting with you about one of my favorite food groups, chocolate. So for the next hour, I'll talk about the history of chocolate. I'll talk about how chocolate is made. I'll also talk about kind of 101 of chocolate. What are the differences between white, milk, dark, and other types? I'll talk about how the professionals do a chocolate tasting, which you might want to try at home. It's kind of like a wine tasting, but you don't have to spit. Now, money doesn't grow on trees, but chocolate does. It grows on these gorgeous, spindly cacao trees. And as you can see, the pods come right from the bark of the tree, and they can vary in color when they're, depending on the type. When they're ripe, they could be yellow or red. And this cacao pod, which is about as big as a papaya, has the magic of chocolate in it. Chocolate's long history began more than 3,000 years ago in Mexico and Central America with the Olmecs, an early Mexican Gulf Coast culture. They were the first society known to have domesticated the cacao tree, and they used the cacao fruit and seeds medicinally and in ceremonial drinks. The Mayans, whose culture flourished from about 250 to 900 AD, were probably introduced to cacao by the Olmecs. The Mayans thought that cacao was a gift from the gods, and they used it in sacred ceremonies. They prepared a chocolate drink in a very large vessel, like the one on the left of your screen, and then they poured it into individual cups like the one on your right, which dates to about the 7th century AD. Now, wealthy and royal Mayans were buried with cacao because they believed that cacao would sustain them in the afterlife, much as the ancient Egyptians would be buried with foods and even replicas of servants to sustain them in the afterlife. Now, several ceramic vessels with traces of cacao were discovered in the tombs of Rio Azul in Guatemala in 1984. And this vessel, which dates to the 5th century AD, has a locking lid that also was tested positive for traces of cacao. they've studied the hieroglyphics, and the archaeologist David Stewart was able to translate the symbols. No one knows exactly what the two types of chocolate that are referred to on the jug, which I wrote out here, but it's assumed that it's two different flavorings that can be used for chocolate. Now, as people of the Aztec Empire spread across Mesoamerica in the 1400s, they began to discover and appreciate cacao. Now, they often couldn't grow it in the dry highlands of central Mexico, so they traded with the Mayans for the beans, which they used as currency. There was a codex that was created in the 16th century, which was traded and now is actually in a museum in Spain. And this is just one page from it. It's showing a Aztec woman mixing the chocolate from a great height, combining the chocolate with water. And in the past, in the beginning, in Central America, they used the local ingredients that were available to combine with the chocolate. Things like chili peppers and vanilla, which grew, and they were combined. But before we get into that, let me just go through what it's like to make and gather cacao. And I had the pleasure of spending several weeks doing just that in Belize. And what I did, I really wanted to see how it was done that perhaps could inform me of how it would have been done thousands of years ago. And I picked just the right person. I picked an itinerant farmer who had permission from various wild cacao trees to gather the cacao pods and to process them. So first morning, I'm all set. It's very hot during the harvesting season. And so I was prepared. And we first started by picking the cacao pods. And you have to be super careful where you pick them, how you snap them off, because that same point is the point where the next cacao will grow. And one tree will have 2 harvests per year. And it's very precious. You only get about 2 pounds of chocolate for each harvest per tree. So very, very careful not to destroy those little points. So I was very carefully picking and picking and picking. And I couldn't wait for my Willy Wonka moment when we first opened the cacao pod. And I just imagined that all this warm chocolate would flow out. I'm even embarrassed to admit that I had a cup waiting to catch it. And so Mr. Pope, who wouldn't let me open one until the end of the day, said, we don't open them until it's cool and after we've done all our picking. And so I wondered what kind of device he was going to use to open the pods. And so when he whipped out a machete and handed me one, I said, maybe you do the cutting, because I ended up in the emergency room just slicing a bagel the other day. So he did the opening, and I stood there literally with my cup waiting and watching. And has anybody actually seen a cacao pod opened? It's amazing. The first one he opened was white, so no chocolate flowed out. And so I thought, okay, it's just one bad one, that's okay. But then he kept going, and I realized he doesn't look concerned, and this is the way it looks, which was a big shock. It looks kind of like corn on steroids. And the other big shock, so first shock, nothing flowed out. Second shock, it's white, not brown. Third shock, the aroma. I didn't even get a Willy Wonka aroma moment. The aroma was amazing. The cacao pod, when it's opened, all of that white is fruit. The cacao fruit smells and tastes like peaches at the height of the summer season, with a little bit of hint of orange blossoms. So floral and fruity. It it's fantastic. If you haven't, I highly recommend that you treat yourself to a visit to a cacao plantation to spend time so you could experience the fresh fruit of the cacao. Now, that fruit is very, very important to developing the flavor of chocolate. So I wasn't allowed to eat it as I was hoping by just the aroma. It was explained to me that we need that fruit so that the chocolate will have a better flavor. So the cacao beans will have a better flavor. Now that tells us already some of the things about chocolate and how important it is because of the flavor profile. The cocoa bean was growing, the seed was growing in this fabulous fruit that's so aromatic and delicious. So chocolate has a natural fruity flavor that's enhanced when the beans are left to ferment. So they're put into a wooden box that's lined with banana leaves, very, very simple, same technique that could have been done 3,000 years ago. And every day, the beans had to be rotated. And that's me, my watch, rotating the beans. I volunteered so that at the end I could lick my fingers because it was so delicious. The fruit is starting to dissolve and it sort of starts to ferment. So it gets that wonderful wine aroma that fruit can give us, fruit wines. And that adds another layer of flavor. There is no alcohol or wine in chocolate, but it was sitting in fermented fruit. So it was absorbing the fruit flavors and even some notes of wine, that wonderful richness. After about 8 days, where they've been left to ferment every day, maybe twice a day, I would volunteer to rotate them so that they fermented evenly. All the fruit would fall off and the cocoa beans would be put out to dry in the sun. And then they do what's called the ballet of cacao beans, where people walk gently through them, not stomping them like making wine in Italy with your feet, but gently walking through to turn them so that they can evenly dry. And that takes about a week, depending on how sunny and warm. Then the cacao beans are sorted so that any bad ones are taken out. And then they're divided into the grades of chocolate because cacao beans can have different grades, better ones, more costly. The secondary ones may be used in another way. And then they're put into sacks and then sent off to the countries that are going to take it to the next step and turn the cacao bean into chocolate. So there's lots of countries that we associate with fine chocolate. Switzerland is famous for its milk chocolate. France makes wonderful chocolate. Italy has fantastic chocolate. America, there are many, many companies here in America who make chocolate. None of those places grow chocolate. Chocolate can only grow in the narrow band of basically around the equator. So no place in mainland America can grow chocolate. And chocolate just started in Central America. That's where it only was. Then it was spread. I'll talk about that in a second. So now they're dry, the 8 days in the sun. Now, after the 8 days of fermenting, 8 or 10 days of drying in the sun, finally, I'm going to get my Willy Wonka moment. Mr. Pope and his wife, Mrs. Pope, save some of the cacao beans for themselves so they can make their own chocolate just for their family's use. And so I got to watch the next step, which was very, very simple homemade chocolate. What would you have to do? Not what the fancy companies do, but what would it have been like thousands of years ago? So pan is put on to heat. In this case, corn cobs are burned for the fuel, and Mrs. Pope even stirs with a corn cob. They use lots of corn in Belize to dry it and grind it for flour. So finally, after about 2 minutes, I'm starting to get the aroma of chocolate. After about 4 minutes, the outside part is beautifully dark black, and now I get a full aroma of chocolate. Finally, more than 2 weeks, I'm getting my Willy Wonka moment, at least the aromas. So the next step is that those cacao beans, that part that cooked, is a very, very thin shell, very thin, much easier to take off than like a peanut shell. And you take off the shell very gently, and then I think you can see in the one in the front, I took a close-up of one where you see some lines. It naturally fractures into little bits called nibs. So the cacao bean, after it's been toasted, sort of fractures into just natural nibs. And you can buy nibs in a gourmet shop or in most health food stores. And nibs are 100% chocolate. Nothing is added, nothing is processed, nothing is done. So if you did buy some nibs, which I highly recommend that you do, and taste a few, you'll put some in your mouth. And if you wait a second and try to let them melt, like you'd melt a piece of chocolate, nothing will happen. You must chew the nibs. And as you chew, you're going to start to create in your mouth a little paste, and you'll get a deep chocolate flavor, but it's not sweet. Chocolate is not naturally sweet. It's only sweet once we add sugar. And there's lots of ways that we can use nibs, sprinkle them in corn muffins, add them to a chocolate cake for just that little bit extra of chocolate flavor, but that isn't sweet, so it's a nice contrast. So that must have happened accidentally. There must have been a cacao bean that fell near the fire. Somebody said, that smells great, pop it in your mouth. They made a paste. They realized, wait a minute, we're grinding that like we grind corn. Maybe let's see what happens when we grind it. And so they would grind it. This is a painting from the late 17th, from the early 1700s. And you see someone grinding it, just as was done thousands of years ago. They would have been ground, the cocoa beans, the nibs would have been ground on stone or terracotta, ground, just like you have to chew them in your mouth. And then once it's ground, all that action makes them kind of warm. And so you can mold the mass that's created and make circles, put them in boxes. They used to sell them in little discs. And that was the way that it was used. Thousands of years ago, the Mayans and the ancient Aztecs would have made it into a ball and then just grated it like a cheese grater. In fact, there are in some museums in Central America where you see a big slab of wood and then teeny tiny little pebbles embedded into it, which creates a natural grater. And so it would be grated and then mixed with water and some of those ingredients that I mentioned, like ground vanilla or chili peppers. So for the majority of chocolate's history, for 90% of the 3,000 years that we've been enjoying chocolate, it has been consumed only as a drink. Cleopatra gave phenomenal dinner parties, famous for never recreating the same one twice. She never tasted chocolate. The ancient Egyptians never tasted chocolate. The ancient Greeks and Romans never had chocolate. Buddha got chubby on something else. No chocolate in ancient China or India. Little Renaissance children could have been as angelic as you want, never tasted chocolate. Chocolate did not leave Central America until Columbus. On his fourth and final voyage, when he was leaving Honduras, he spotted a trading vessel. So just like I do at the airport when I'm coming back to the States after a trip, I've got to get one last souvenir. He boarded the vessel and wanted to do some last minute shopping. And he noticed that the merchants were asking a fortune for what he thought was a bag of almonds. They were cacao beans. And he knew that by the way they were treating them and how much they asked for them, that they were very special. So he bought them and brought them to Queen Isabella. He had no idea how to use them, how they were used. He had no idea, but it was the first documentation of the cacao bean coming from the New World into the Old World. Then Cortez, 20 years later, came back and he spent time with Montezuma. And spending time with Montezuma, he realized how cacao was treated and how it was used. And he came with other explorers that were some that were note takers and historians that documented what they were seeing and observing. And the historians that were with Cortez noted that Montezuma drank this special drink, which Montezuma shared with his esteemed guests. And they noticed that he would drink a goblet 40 times a day, and that he coincidentally had 40 wives, and he would drink a goblet and visit a wife, then leave, then later visit another wife, and all the wives seemed very happy, and they decided that it must be an aphrodisiac. And so that was the first that news started to spread or be generated about chocolate being an aphrodisiac. They also wrote back to King Charles reporting that when they tasted it, this drink gave them so much energy. They weren't hungry. They had lots of energy. They also felt that any kind of ailment felt better. And of course, part of what they were so excited about was the fact that, number one, there's lots of antioxidants in chocolate. So it's healthy for you, just like the antioxidants in red grapes, in some black tea. But it was the first time someone from the old world had tasted anything with caffeine. Tea and coffee had not yet been introduced into Europe. And so the little bit of caffeine was also giving them this feeling of amazing energy. So the Cortez and the explorers brought back lots of cacao beans to Spain, and when they went to Spain, they explained how the locals were making the chocolate drink by mixing it with water and the local ingredients and serving it at room temperature. This is an early painting of Spanish chocolate, and you'll see a couple of things. In the foreground, you see those little circles. Those are the chocolates that would be grated. They're not chocolate cakes, they're just chocolate. And then the cookies and the roll, if you look in the old cookbooks of that time period, you'll notice that they're called chocolate cookies and chocolate cake. And that's because they don't have chocolate in them though, but they're to be eaten with chocolate and in a cup. Now there is this wonderful device that's used in there to blend the chocolate. I hope you can see that. And they would blend the chocolate with the water. There was another thing that the Spaniards did, two things actually with it. They knew exactly how it was eaten, drunk, but they wanted to change two things. One is that in Central America, it's much warmer than in Spain, so they thought that it would benefit from being boiled. The water would be boiled. They thought that the molecules would combine better. And they thought it tasted great, but maybe a little sugar would help. And so the Spaniards added sugar. They weren't doing that in Central America, already starting to make it a little less healthy. This is a beautiful painted tile showing how a group of servants are preparing chocolate for a wealthy picnic, outdoor picnic. From Spain, chocolate next went into Italy through the two ports, Venice and Livorno. And the fact that Spain had territories in Italy, so they brought chocolate into, for example, Naples and Sicily. And so you have a very old tradition in Naples and Sicily of the same kind of chocolate that and chocolate making as in Central America. In fact, that technique of stone grinding the chocolate, which is still done in many Mexican chocolate makers, is done also in Sicily. They don't do the really smooth, creamy kind. I'll explain. So in Italy, the Italians, as you may know, love to fool around. They love to fool around with ingredients. They took one look at the cocoa beans, which, depending on what language you're speaking, we say bean, but it's not a legume. It's a seed. And the Italians immediately realized that. They understood what the Spaniards were doing. They understood that it was a drink, but they thought, look at these. They're seeds like fennel, cumin, coriander. Seeds are spices. You can grind them, maybe not so much as has been done to make the drink, like a pulp, but maybe a little bit like black pepper. And let's see what happens when we start to cook with it. And so the Italians, very surprising, were actually the first to cook with chocolate. And they created many, many, many chocolate things. They created chocolate sorbet. Already in Sicily, you had a very long history of iced drinks, lemon, we often call ices, Italian ices. And so it was very natural for them to then make a water-based sweet, a sorbetto of chocolate. They also did things like put a little bit of gently ground nibs, like think of the texture of black pepper, on polenta. And the Italian expression is that if it grows together, it goes together. And they knew that polenta came from far away, from over there, the same place as chocolate. They didn't quite think in terms of old world, new world, but they knew it wasn't from their place, that it went with, that it might go with chocolate. And so they thought it did, which actually you could do a little test yourself. Polenta is naturally sweet. And that little bit of crushed nibs on it gives it a nice crunch and an interesting contrast in flavors. So the Italians did many, many, many things with chocolate. In fact, so many dishes that there were actually satirical poems about the fact that Italians will put chocolate on any food. You know, we're talking back in the late 1600s, 1700s, that it was crazy. There are still some that survive today in the many, many dishes that are very traditional. And that is like a pasta, that the pasta dough that's made with chocolate so that it has a flavor, and a very traditional way to serve it is you take the chocolate pasta and you toss it with a little bit of gorgonzola, which is blue cheese from Italy, and some toasted, chopped up walnuts. Very delicious. They also knew that tomatoes came from over there. And so maybe tomatoes and chocolate would go well together. And there's a dish from Sicily called schiabbo, which is very traditional at Christmas time to have on Christmas Day, where you combine a pork ragu with chocolate. Again, very dark chocolate. It's not sweet till you add sugar. It really adds an interesting intensity. Most people just think that it ends up tasting like an interesting mushroom, but very, very delicious, very easy to do a taste test. So now let's talk about mole. Now, mole with chocolate wasn't invented until the colonial period in the late 17th century. They made mole, ground up dried peppers, but didn't add the chocolate until much later. And there are two areas of Mexico that are renowned for their fantastic mole. They're the best known moles. Of course, there's other states in Mexico that and other regions that make phenomenal mole. Comes in lots of flavors, as you know, lots of ingredients. Chili peppers is the common ingredient, and the classic mole is called mole poblano, which is dark red or even brown sauce that's served traditionally over meats. There's a common legend that it was created at the convent of Santa Clara in Pueblo early in the 17th century, but just one of many, many legends. The true story of how mole developed may never be known, but we do know that it was not in print until in a printed recipe until after 1810. Of course, one of the reasons that this isn't surprising is that when you think about that this was a sacred food, this was used for religious events in ancient times. It would be kind of like asking a person who follows Catholicism to use the wine that the priest is blessing for Mass in a French wine sauce. It wasn't, the chocolate was very special and reserved for special occasions and as that special drink. And so it wasn't until the old world influence that they started to use it in cooking. So now from Italy, chocolate went next into England, and England already had a custom of drinking hot beverages in bars, in their pubs. They'd had all sorts of hot toddies. So when they got the hot chocolate from Spain, they thought, oh, this is fantastic. We love it. And since they mostly had their hot drinks in pubs, they thought, let's add a little bit of spirits to it. And so they were the first to add spirits to the chocolate drink. And then the English had a notorious sweet tooth at that time. We're talking, the end of 1600s, 1700s, early 1700s. And they decided, the Spaniards, the French, the Italians, they put a little sugar, maybe even more sugar would be better. They mix it with water, but you know what? We've got great cream up here. Let's mix it with cream. And so they turned the hot chocolate from just a water-based drink into this milk-based drink with lots of sugar, what they preferred. Now, throughout history, when health writers write, they write about food. First of all, just even think about Hippocrates. Let food be thy medicine. In the past, centuries ago, they needed to talk about food because they would use the food as ingredients for making medicines. They would also use food as a way to help to cure you by taking away medicine, taking away food that could be causing you some problems, or adding some foods that they thought could be beneficial. So it's very common for physicians to write about food. Dr. Henry Stubbs wrote a book about chocolate, and he called it the Indian Nectar because they were still a little confused, even in the late 1600s, about where chocolate came from. They thought it was from India. There's a lot of confusion back then about where things came from. In fact, we just had Thanksgiving, right? Turkey, by the way, got its name. You know how? It's an American bird. It came when the explorers brought back the turkey to the old world. They didn't realize exactly where it was coming from. It was from someplace far away. And they thought, maybe it's from Turkey. So they called it a turkey. It should be called an America, but anyway. So they called it in the book, the Indian Nectar. And he wrote all about the health benefits, ways to use it. And he believed that it could cure everything. You have a stomach ache, have some chocolate. Your head hurts, have some chocolate. He also agreed with Cortez's men who observed that for Montezuma, it may be an aphrodisiac. And he thought that it was an aphrodisiac, that it would help with all sorts of problems in that area. And in fact, Henry Stubbs made a fortune because he created the first massage cream. He created this salve of chocolate for people, for men who were having problems. Instead of Viagra, he recommended that you rub this cream onto the afflicted area until the desired results are achieved. He sold a lot of the cream. Now, the chocolate was used in the very best brothels and continued that tradition of associating it with aphrodisiacs. So as I mentioned, chocolate was stone ground or terracotta ground, but ground by hand. This made it a little bit gritty. If you've ever had some good Mexican chocolate or Sicilian chocolate, you know what I mean? That it's sort of like the difference between white bread and whole wheat bread. Well, to get it creamy and smooth, we needed the Industrial Revolution and Lindt. Rudolf Lindt, who was Swiss, didn't love the grittiness. He wanted it smoother. And when you try to stone grind for as long as it takes to make it smooth, everybody will quit because it takes about 70 hours. And you can't seem to transfer one employee grinding it to the next because just that transfer time makes it seize up and you can't restart the process. So Lindt, name in chocolate, invented a machine called the conching machine in the 1800s. And that's stone on stone grinding, just like would be done by hand, but by machine. So it could go for 70 or 80 hours so that all the little molecules of the nibs could be ground fine enough so that it would be smooth. So we have the smoothness of chocolate. We have Rudolf Lindt to thank. Now we have another name that we know, Henry Nestle. Nestle was a dairy farmer in Switzerland. And one year he had a bumper crop of milk. And so he worked on figuring out how to make shelf-stable milk. And when he did that, he realized that the milk could be combined with chocolate and stay without getting rancid. And so he created milk chocolate. Next innovation was pressing the cacao beans so that you extract the solid from the fat. The fat is called cocoa butter and the solid is cocoa powder. And once that was process happened, you could do lots and lots of things, some of them not so good, which is that you could take the cocoa butter, which is wonderful in chocolate because it gives it the fabulous mouthfeel and makes it creamy and smooth in your mouth, but it's expensive. And if you sell it to the pharmaceutical companies, so they make suntan lotions and creams, you could then just use the solids to make chocolate product and add some kind of other fat. So it was good, bad. The good part of separating was that they could invent milk chocolate. And milk chocolate is generally 1/3 cocoa butter, 1/3 milk, 1/3 sugar. By the way, milk chocolate is basically 1/3 sugar, 1/3 ground chocolate, cocoa, and 1/3 milk. Now, Europe did all of those things. Chocolate actually, even though it was from Central America, it actually got introduced into the United States from the Old World and was brought here. And people like Thomas Jefferson, who first tasted it in France, brought the technology over, thought that it was going to replace coffee and tea as the national drink. He thought it was phenomenal. Benjamin Franklin, in his almanac, thought that it could be used as a cure for smallpox. Washington and Martha Washington both adored chocolate. She would even save those shell that came off the cocoa bean that you saw at the beginning, and she would add it to boiling water to make kind of a tea from it. And George Washington spent several $100s every year on chocolate, a fortune back then. Another name in chocolate is Hershey. And Milton Hershey started out as a candy salesman. He was selling caramels, they're made with cream and sugar. He's from Pennsylvania, where they had wonderful dairy cows, and he sold them to different candy shops. And then he went to the World's Fair and he saw a machine called a tempering machine. And that's a machine that melts chocolate and keeps it at a certain temperature so that anything you dip in it, when you take it out and it comes to room temperature, will make a nice shell around it, like dipping strawberries in chocolate. He thought that the machine would be great to dip his caramels in. So he bought it, and then he made a batch of caramels dipped in chocolate and brought it to all his customers. And he asked who, try it, give them away, see what you think. I'll come back next week. So he came back the next week and he said, okay, great. How many would you like to order? And they said, well, none. And he said, what, you didn't like them? He said, no, we love them, but we love just the chocolate part. Could you just give us like a little dollop of chocolate and forget the caramel? And so Hershey launched Kisses and the chocolate business. Now, there are a couple of ways that nowadays we can taste and experience chocolate. One of them is that we can taste single origin chocolate, just like we have single origin coffee, coffee that only comes from Hawaii, coffee that's only grown in Jamaica. The same thing with cocoa beans. Where they grow affects their flavor. It's called the terroir. Just like we have that with wine. Wine from a particular area is very, very special because the air that's near there, the soil, contributes to the flavor. And so chocolate from Madagascar will taste incredibly different than chocolate from Costa Rica. Even in South America, Venezuelan chocolate tastes very different than Ecuadorian chocolate. And so it might be fun to do a chocolate tasting of single origin to see the differences. And there's actually some companies that sell chocolate that already do that. They sell it particular countries so that you can taste it in a nice little packet. Now, there's another way that you can do a chocolate tasting, and that is to taste different percentages of chocolate. So what's a percentage of chocolate? What does it mean if it's 53%? It says that dark chocolate 53, or if it says 70%. It means that it's 70% ground cocoa beans, 30% sugar. If it's dark chocolate, it just means what percentage is chocolate versus the sugar. So you could do a tasting to see which is your favorite. You might think you're a 70%er, but maybe you're an 85%er. And so you can do a tasting of just the different percentages. Now I have a question. What is the difference between bittersweet chocolate and semi-sweet chocolate? I don't know. Semi-sweet and bittersweet are just adjectives that are used by different companies. So your company's bittersweet might be 70%, and your company's 70%, 80% might be bittersweet. So, or semi-sweet. They're just interchangeable. They don't mean anything. And that's why more and more companies are using the percentages to kind of tell you what the difference is. Now, I have a confession to make. You know baker's chocolate in the supermarket? I did not learn until I was in college that you're allowed to bake with other chocolate besides baker's chocolate. Yep, baker's chocolate. It's just called that because that's his name, Baker. Use great quality chocolate in your baking, and you'll get a great quality tasting dessert or savory food. So now there's lots of ways that you can eat chocolate. You can do whatever you want, but let me just tell you how the professionals would explain how to taste some fine chocolate. And the first thing would be to take your piece of plain dark chocolate and smell it. We first taste with our nose. So what aromas are you getting? Do you get some notes of wine? Remembering that it's fermented, do you smell a little bit of the fruit smell because it was fermented in fruit and grew in fruit? Does it have maybe even a little nutty aroma? Because the toasting of it can kind of be reminiscent of the taste of the aroma of nuts, even though no nuts in the bar. Now, the next thing that the professionals do is kind of weird, which is to listen to your chocolate. And that is to take your piece of dark chocolate and to snap it. The professionals do that because when you break dark chocolate in half, you should hear a very loud snap. That's because cocoa butter at room temperature is totally solid and will make a snapping sound. It only will melt at body temperature, 98, 99 degrees. And so they want to make sure that there aren't non-cocoa butter oils in the chocolate. And that's one of the easiest ways to tell. If the chocolate maker was taking out some of the cocoa butter and selling that and substituting some less expensive tropical oils or other oils, you want to know that. And the snap test is one of the best. Now comes tasting. And so we're going to think about babies who have no teeth and take a Zen moment. And so what they would recommend is that in a little square of chocolate, you take a tiny bit and you put it on your tongue and you don't chew. Just let it slowly dissolve so that it hits all of the taste buds, so the cocoa butter gets a chance to slowly melt, so you get that feeling of why chocolate is so special because of the cocoa butter, because of that wonderful mouth feel, and so that you can start to experience the wonderful waves of flavor that good quality chocolate has. So now I have a question. How did they get the cherry in there? It's kind of like the ship in the bottle, right? This is a question I'm always asked right away, so I thought I would go ahead and just answer it now. Remember the tempering machine that Hershey had? Many chocolatiers have them. And so what they do is they take a mold, think of an ice cube tray, or if you are a candy maker, a candy mold, and put it, coat it with tempered chocolate that when it comes to room temperature will get hard, and then tap it, clear it off, and then scrape everything excess away, and then fill it with, in this case, he's filling it with with a white chocolate ganache, or you could put your cherry and liqueur in the center, then go back to the tempered chocolate, coat it, scrape it off, and then wait a couple of minutes so it gets to room temperature and it just pops out because it will constrict a little bit as it cools, and you've got your ship in a bottle. Now, after this talk, in the next day, you will be receiving a handout that I prepared, which has some recipes, both sweet and savory, for using chocolate. And so that I hope you'll try chocolate in some different ways, both sweet and savory. It's a wonderful ingredient to use. I even don't even need to write this as a recipe, but I love it I'm in the Northeast, so it's chilly, and so I like to make oven roasted vegetables, and it's wonderful when they come out to grate some dark chocolate on top. It ends up melting just a little bit, and it tastes like the best balsamic vinegar. Guests love it. So I hope you'll leave this talk with a new appreciation of chocolate and inspiration to try cooking with chocolate. There's lots of trends in chocolate that are going on in chocolate candy. One is a pretty old trend, 20 years, of mixing salt in chocolate. Salt, as you know, enhances the flavor of everything. During World War II, when there were shortages of chocolate, the cookbooks and ladies' magazines would recommend that you add a little bit of extra salt to your cake because you were cutting down on sugar. It increases the flavor. So they've taken that idea with salt and then extended it to potato chips and pretzels in chocolate. They even did bacon and chocolate, a combination that was introduced here in New York City a dozen years ago and made a big hit at the New York Chocolate Show, with real bacon dipped in dark chocolate. It's actually delicious. I mean, so smoky, salty, fatty bacon, wonderful dark chocolate is really terrific. And lots of chocolate companies have picked up on that, and you can get bars of chocolate. Vosges, a company that sounds French, but it's actually based in Chicago, makes a very nice one if you're interested in tasting it, or you can just taste it with your bacon tomorrow morning. They, of course, replicating what was done centuries ago. Their very favorite combination of flavors for chocolate is with chili peppers, the heat of the chocolate. Now, I want to just end with Mexican chocolate. What is Mexican chocolate? So it's ground chocolate, like I mentioned, that is kind of gritty. It has a almost rustic texture instead of that smoothie, creamy texture of the European conch chocolate. And many companies like this one say Mexican chocolate, but they're not made in Mexico. And they're not even made with Mexican cacao beans. They're made in the Mexican style. Now, this chocolate, although it's made in the United States, does use Mexican cacao beans from very specific growers in Tabasco, Mexico. And it's stone ground, just like the ancient tradition. And they even use lava stones from the area. So I highly recommend this chocolate. This chocolate is made in Mexico, and the company was founded 95 years ago in Guadalajara. And you can even see from that broken disc that it's a little bit gritty. I want to thank you so much for joining me for this whirlwind look at chocolate's amazing history. And I hope you'll donate generously to the Latin American Relief Fund. And I hope you'll try lots and lots of chocolate in lots of new and different ways. So thank you so much. Let's see now. Questions.
Do you want to take a couple of questions?
We only had one question from Cher. Do you want to ask it, Cher? Or you can unmute yourself to ask the questions.
Yes, I would love to ask a question. And I'd also say thank you for the wonderful, fascinating presentation. My husband and I visited Venezuela and a chocolate plantation there many years ago in 2006. And I think we learned as much, if not more, today. So the question was, I love polenta. We both do. And we love to cook with it. And I was very interested in the fact that you could combine chocolate with polenta. So I wondered if it would be good to cook it in it, as it let it melt in as you're heating the polenta before it firms up I usually put it in a loaf pan. Or do you just, as Rebecca suggested, maybe grate it and put it on top? So maybe she has some interesting recipes or ideas on how to do that.
The Italians generally treat it like you treat grated cheese. What they like is to cook the polenta. They generally tend to like distinct flavors. They don't so much like melding things. And so what they generally do, the way I've ever had it in Italy, is that they make the polenta and then they would take the nibs. And if you could possibly put them into the ideal would be to get some nibs and to put them in a pepper grinder and use your nibs, grind them a little bit and put them right on top. And this way it gives a pretty color and a pretty contrast with the crunch. Of course, if you don't want to do that and don't want to have to bother looking for nibs, I highly recommend using instead two things. One is just a high percentage of dark chocolate. So an 85%, you can even find 100% dark chocolate. And then use your cheese grater or your microplane and grate that right on top of the cooked polenta. Or actually even just think of macaroni and cheese, like with a Parmesan cheese, toss your pasta with Parmesan until it gets kind of creamy with a little bit of the cooking water from the pasta, and then put a little bit of the ground up nibs on top. It's a very, very nice flavor combination. But so using the nibs in the pepper grinder or the dark chocolate that you grate with a microplane or cheese grater. Or another thing for cooking is cocoa powder. And if you get natural cocoa powder, it keeps its antioxidants. The Dutch process is delicious also. You lose some of the antioxidants, but they're both terrific tasting. And what's great is a tablespoon is only about 15 calories. So you can get a burst of chocolate flavor in so many things for so few calories, so simply with good natural cocoa powder. Sprinkle that on the polenta, put that into oatmeal, mix it into yogurt, plain yogurt, and then put the cocoa powder. If you want, you can put a little bit of sugar or honey or whatever your favorite sweetener is, but cocoa powder is fantastic to use to give you that little extra chocolate in everything. I like chocolate in many, many things.
Thank you, Francine. Those are great ideas.
You're very welcome. Well, again, it was a delight sharing this time with everyone. And I wish everyone, we have one more question. Yes, honey, would you like to unmute or would you like to type in the question? Honey raised her hand, but she's unmuted.
Okay. Hi, Francine. Thank you so much for coming today. Thank you. Here's David. We really, really appreciate your saying yes to this. And I just, here we are in California, near Mexico. So greetings to everybody. I just had a quick question about fair trade. You know, with coffee, you see often, buy the fair trade. Do we have that kind of categorization or categories for chocolate? Do you see that happening more and more? And what would you say about it?
That's a very interesting question. I try to be dutiful and buy fair trade because fair trade just sounds good and fair, and I want to be fair. And an interesting thing happened. I was writing an article and I had to interview a bunch of plantation owners and a bunch of chocolate companies from around the world. And I got a shocking answer, which is they said, thank you for trying to do fair trade. But you know what? It costs us money. We have to pay to participate in fair trade. We're small plantations. It's very fair. And we just can't participate in the process. And so we're missing out on places like Whole Foods because they only want to do fair trade. And so in fact, it isn't only a perfect system. So fair trade is fine for those who can afford it, but basically there are many, many producers, including coffee producers, who cannot afford to participate in the process to make their product be called fair trade. But yet they're organic. They've got these countries, some of them have no pesticide. It's so simple and nothing. So it isn't the magic answer that I had thought before I talked to so many. So you can get fair trade, but you can also feel not guilty at all to get some other good quality chocolate and enjoy it. You're supporting.
Thanks.
Great. Well, again, thank you so much, everyone. You'll be receiving the recipes, and I hope you enjoy them and try them, and have wonderful, wonderful holidays.
Yes, thank you so much, Francine. We so appreciate your participation today. I think everyone got a lot out of it. So thank you and happy holidays to everybody. And we will see you all in the new year.
Thank you.